first thing I want to talk to you about, Michel Serres, is this idea of handedness. Yes, rather selfishly, this applies to myself. So would and that's my way into everything, David, you know. How does this affect me? Well, the point is, I, like Michel Serres, is someone who is coarse-handed. So I was born left-handed, but I was made right with my right hand.
Just like Serres, yeah.
For various cultural, economic and religious reasons.
Yes.
But Serres, he makes something of this, and I thought that might be a useful way to his thinking.
Sure. I mean, I think it's something I can say a word or two about that now, and I think it's something that will become a bit clearer as we go on, and that we can come back to. There's a couple of points I think to think about this. First of all, is that he says many times that we never begin from any one place in particular. We're always in the middle of things. If we are in the middle of things, then just speaking in very simple terms, if we're in the middle of things, then that's quite handy to be both-handed, if you like.
Not my practical experience, but
because what he says about this is that when he was left-handed and was then taught as a young boy to be right-handed, to write with his right hand and so on. And he says the usual reaction is to be quite resentful about this and to say I was made to do something unnatural and so on. But he said that he was always very happy about this because it made him something like ambidextrous. It meant that he could use both hands. And he describes the condition of being one-handed as being hemiplegic.
That's the word, yeah.
Yeah. And he said this was great because it sort of made me whole in a way. It made me... Right. Now, I think the point for him is not actually about being whole, because the idea of wholes don't really figure in his thinking very much. I think the idea is that you are comfortably in the middle of things. Right.
Yeah, I'm not ambidextrous. That's the difference. Like I'm non-handed. Yeah. I've got no hands. You've seen my handwriting.
That's probably a little different. So, for example, he talks about the experience of swimming and how swimming is great because you move in a way which is symmetrical, basically, in your body. And he talks about the great experience of being in the middle of when you're swimming out from one bank to another and arriving in the middle of the stream, and that moment when you can't quite go back, but you're not safe yet on the other side. And he says that is the experience of swimming across a river, you know, which I'm sure he would have done lots of times in his youth when he was growing up. So there's all this sense of being in the middle of things, and I think that the two-handedness is a little bit about that. You know,
that's a good place to start talking about it because he's just a philosopher of the between.
He is a philosopher of the between. Yeah, I mean, the one point I'd just add, and then we can come back to it as well later, is that we'll come back to it, I'm sure. Is that he thinks that one of the things that's distinctive about the human being is that it is sort of de-differentiated. So whereas we think of evolution as moving towards specialization to occupy a particular niche, one of the things that's most significant about human beings is becoming de-differentiated, that we have multiple potentials. Right? And again, I think the handedness thing maybe ties in a little bit there too, and we'll come back to that. I mean, maybe we talk about some of the ideas we want to move on to later. But that there is that sense of not being quite specialised, having options. That is also something which features a lot in his thinking. But you want to talk about the being in the middle of things, yeah?
Yeah. Well, I thought it would be an interesting way of talking about him. What drew you to this chap first? He's an interesting figure in the history of continental philosophy, I suppose. He's, you have written on some of the key figures in continental philosophy. You've written on your Foucaults, and you've got a book on Heidegger. But he's a little bit different, this guy, isn't he? So what drew you to him first?
What drew me to him first? Well, in literal terms, I was invited to do some work on him. Our colleague Bill Ross, who was then running a publishing company, Continuum Press, asked if I wanted to be involved in the preparation of the English translation of The Birth of Physics, Michel Serres' book on Lucretius. And I jumped at the chance because it sounded interesting, and I knew it would be an opportunity for me to learn some more about him, because I'd read some Serres before. I'd picked up some of Serres' books before. And to be honest, I was stuck. I found him very I was nonplussed. I didn't know how to read him, and he confused me a lot. So I thought, okay, well, this would be a chance to try and find out some more. So I said yes. And in the course of working on that book, I completely fell in love with the book, and in part also completely fell in love with Serres' thinking. Why? What is it about him? I've always, I suppose, had an interest in the ideas of contingency and how we make sense of chance, I suppose, in our lives and in the world. And those themes are very strong in Serres' work, very prominent. And once I started to get to grips a little bit with Serres' thinking and writing, I found that his writing is just a joy to be with, really. I mean, he writes beautifully, and he writes in a really quite an unusual way, and a thoroughly enjoyable way. I just think it is just a pleasure to read and to think along with when you read his books.
And unlike some of his contemporaries, he's someone who definitely works at the intersection of the arts and the sciences. I mean, again, that's him being in the middle, I guess. And he's, unlike his contemporaries, he's steeped in science and mathematics.
It's all there, yeah.
Yeah, I think unlike, say,
yes.
We know Heidegger knew about maths and science.
Yeah. No, he was. That's one of the other things that I think is just so attractive about him. And I've already mentioned it in a way, he's not a specialist. Or else he's a specialist in everything. I mean, he's incredibly well informed and knowledgeable and insightful about so many different things. But yeah, he had a very strong background in mathematics, and he realized that mathematics was a key to thinking about how to think, if you like, very early on in his work, right from the very, very beginning. So he has that connection to mathematics. He's was always interested in science, rather more than what his philosophical contemporaries were doing, to be perfectly honest. He says in various interviews and things that he read Heidegger, but it all felt like he was writing about a world that had disappeared or was disappearing.
Which is quite a Heideggerian point, that, isn't it? If you think about it. It's like Heidegger's point is that the historical determines meaning.
That world, in a way, was disappearing. I suppose they felt rather differently about that, I suppose. He was completely absorbed with things that were happening in technology, with scientific advances. He thought that things that had happened in thermodynamics, in quantum physics, in information theory, people thinking that the work by Prigogine and Stengers on biochemistry and emergence and all of these things were actually far more significant and interesting philosophically than going back over Husserl's analysis of time, for example, which was this is one of the examples he gives as something he just
poor old Husserl
didn't really feel that he was getting the enough out of, and he felt sort of so he was always engaged with the sciences and with the history of science far more than he was with the main figures that we think of around him, perhaps his peers, or shall we say far more. He was involved with the sciences and history of mathematics and sciences and so on far more than he was engaged with all the other things that his peers were engaged with. Right? They were all thinking about themes to do with phenomenology and subjectivity, or they were thinking about psychoanalysis or Marxism and so on, and he just was not. So he really was quite unusual.
Yeah, because he's not. That's what interests me about him, even though I know, as we discussed, remarkably little about him, which is why you're here, I guess. But unlike his contemporaries, he's not. He doesn't fit with the continental tradition, I think, strictly. But he doesn't fit with the analytic tradition either, does he?
No, that's right. I think he was quite happy not to fit in too much. He often in interviews and in some of his texts, he often complains about the fact that he feels like he'd been made homeless by the philosophical community in France and Paris in particular. I think he carried a little bit of rancor and resentment about that with him. But in another way, he is a bit of a born misfit in a way. He was never really going to be simply a part of that world, and so you can't really fit him in anywhere entirely. But I think if you were going to link him anywhere, if you're going to try to fit him into any one kind of group or set of interests, it would really be in French philosophy of science, epistemology, history of science. There, I mean, with the figure of Bachelard, Gaston Bachelard behind him, and in some ways also Continuum, although he fell out with Continuum over one or two things. But yeah, it's probably that tradition of thinking about the history of science and history of mathematics that is closest to him. But the interesting thing is that for him, very quickly it stopped being anything about internal problems to do with those fields, and immediately became about how you can take something from these fields and learn about thinking. And learn about thinking in ways that then immediately become translatable into other fields and other ways of thinking and other topics. He was never one for just having a single focal point and sort of a deeper dive into a particular problem. He was always connecting, relating, and sort of on the move in his thinking in all kinds of ways. And that's actually really important in terms of how he understands what philosophy is and what it can do and how we think. It's not just his individual sort of idiosyncrasy, if you like. It's actually right there in what he thinks it is to think and to do philosophy.
Yeah, so thinking requires both the poetic and the scientific. And of course he was, am I right in this, factually he was the chair of the history of science at Sorbonne, yeah?
Yeah, he taught the history of science, yes. So he's in the history department, yes, not the philosophy department, which he was on the floor above, which he was always a little bit unhappy about. But yes, that's right.
Yeah, so let's try and get into the weeds a bit. And I was thinking that we could talk a little bit about some of his more broader influences. And there's two striking figures, I think, and that's Leibniz and Bachelard.
Yeah.
And Leibniz, he wrote a book on Leibniz, which is one of his first books, I believe, which is not translated, I don't think.
It's not as yet translated, although there is work underway. Not by me, I hasten to add, but watch this space. Yeah, that was his PhD thesis, which was monumental, something like 850 pages of analysis of Leibniz's thinking in terms of Leibniz's mathematical models and how Leibniz thought, how mathematically or used certain mathematical models, but features, ways of thinking, how that becomes part of his thinking generally, and it becomes very much part of Serres' thinking generally. So I was just trying to explain briefly what that means. He's very interested in Leibniz because Leibniz is not a systematic thinker in the classical sense, that he sets out foundations and then elaborates them and arrives at a series of positions and explains how the whole architectonic works or anything like that. Rather, he's more of his works are articulated through multiple short pieces rather than one great work or something like that, right? The question then becomes, when you read at Leibniz, when people come to Leibniz, is where to begin and what to take as the right entry point. Do you work on his mathematics? Do you work on his metaphysics or his theological work or his account of dynamics and forces? And where do you begin with all of this? Serres' point is that you can actually begin anywhere, and wherever you begin, you end up, if you think through Leibniz's system from there, you end up creating a distinctive Leibniz, in effect, and that Leibniz's work is all of these, but in a way which is superimposed, if you like, one on the other, so that you find your way through them, one to the next to another. But there's no single correct way of doing this. So there's a system, but it's a system of all of these things, all of the approaches taken together. So you can begin here, begin there. You end up with different versions, different readers of Leibniz. Okay, take all of these together. That would be something like the right Leibniz who's reading. But there is no single right Leibniz is reading that we can do. Of course, this actually reflects Leibniz's philosophy itself, the idea that in the monadology, that everything is connected to everything else, everything is an expression of everything else, and that there's an infinity of perspectives that you can take on the world, and there is no single true perspective apart from the integral of all possible perspectives, which is what God can manage, being smarter than we are. Right.
Yeah, I was thinking that I could see why Leibniz would be, map onto Serres, because Leibniz is scientific metaphysician.
Yeah, in a way, yes, he is. This is, and there's a sort of a play that happens between the sense that everything is connected to everything else in a material form. So everything literally impacts and connects with everything else. But this becomes a metaphysics in Leibniz. But yes, the key thing that comes out of Leibniz for Serres is that this is a thinking of relations. Everything is connected to everything else, and we have to think through relations. We don't begin with any single one point and think that that's going to give us the...
So there's that betweenness again, yeah.
Yeah. A little example of this. We have the classical story of the cave, where, Plato's cave, where you go down and you find the prisoners chained up down the bottom of the cave, and there's the fire, and the fire is casting shadows of images and so on in the walls in front of them. And that this is the sense of us being caught in this realm of illusions, and we have to find our way out of the cave, or be dragged out of the cave up to the sun, and then we can see truly. And of course, in this story, and the sun is the one true light, the light of truth. And whereas for Serres counterposes to this a story taken from Jules Verne of descending into a cave, and then the explorers descend down into the cave, and the cave on the ceiling of the cave are crystals everywhere, and all their lanterns begin to shine lights to the crystals, which reflect and refract the light all the way across, backwards and forwards across the cave. So there is no single true one light. There are multiple lights, each of which is reflecting and passing on, communicating all of the other lights. So you end up with this complex world where everything is lit in multiple ways through multiple relations to everything else. That's his world, not Plato's cave. Yeah.
Now, speaking of ancient philosophy, one of the figures that we might have something in common with that we're both interested in is Lucretius.
Yeah.
And you are the translator of Michel Serres', what's that in French? It's got to say something like La naissance de physique.
La naissance de la physique, yeah.
So that's the birth of physics.
Yeah.
And that's Michel Serres' intellectual engagement with Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, also on the nature of things.
Yeah.
Now, that text, that book, is a great book, that's usually treated as proto-science. It's more seen as significant because of its poetic quality. It's one of the great works of poetry, and it is one of the great works of poetry, philosophy, or literary philosophy. But Serres, being Serres, thinks that it's not the poetry that's as important. Well, the poetry is important, but it's his scientific insights.
Yeah.
So could you perhaps speak about that a little bit, David? Because I know in The Birth of Physics, it's all about Lucretius's very active account of atomism, early atomism.
Yes.
Yeah. And his notion of this idea of the clinamen and turbulence, which Serres sees as profoundly valuable in the scientific sense.
Absolutely. First of all, translated The Birth of Physics with Bill Ross, co-translator. Don't forget Bill.
Sorry, Bill.
There's a couple. There's various moves that Serres makes in order to draw a quite different reading out of Lucretius, or a different reading to the usual one that you've outlined. The first is that he says, look, why is it that people say that Lucretius is just this lovely bit of poetry and there's some interesting ideas in here, but it's essentially literature, not science, because it's a bit woolly around the edges and so on. Well, the reason they say that, or one of the reasons they say that, is because we think of science as being mathematical. In order for science to be rigorous, it has to be mathematical. Right? And of course, there's no mathematics in De Rerum Natura. It's all poetry. So, there we go. What he then does is say, all right, well, what is it that Lucretius is doing here? He's setting up this scenario about how the universe works. Right? And as you say, that begins with the imagined state, if you like, of atoms raining down through the void, through an infinite void, atoms raining down in perfect straight lines. And of course, that is an image of perfect, sounds like perfect order in a way, but really it's perfect disorder. There's just nothing. There isn't anything. Right? There's nothing which you could point to say, right, there's something, which would be a form of order of some kind. Perfect disorder. Now, and then at some point there is this swerve, this clinamen, which happens entirely spontaneously, without cause. That leads to collisions between atoms, and then more collisions, it spirals, and that becomes turbulence. And then from that turbulence, vortices begin to form as atoms, having collided, begin to combine and then move with more regularity. And that, so the turbulence turns into vortices. And the vortices then are dynamic patterns of order, really. Then he says we are all vortices. Everything is a vortex. So his interest then is in how matter forms quasi-stable forms that are dynamic, not static. Now, having outlined that, he says, well, wouldn't it be lovely if we had a mathematics that could deal with this? and then he said, well, actually there was one, and it belonged to Archimedes. Archimedes developed a mathematics that could deal with all of these topics, all of these things, there were spirals and slightly disordered movements and multiplicities and all kinds of things. So he combines Lucretius's poetic presentation of these ideas with an Archimedean mathematics and says, there you go, ancient science.
Sorted.
Ancient science, right? But actually it's a very contemporary science as well, because it is about, he also, as usual, reads all of this through lots of other things, but in the main through Leibniz as well, and through thermodynamics, which is something we might come on to. So this is this ancient atomism then, rather than being about little fundamental bits of matter, becomes a theory of flow, becomes a theory of multiple flows and dynamic fluid relations and how they begin to settle or not settle into more stable forms, which then that's Lucretius' account of how a world forms. Right?
Yeah, so Lucretius, that is, for Serres, is anticipating the theory of disorder, which generates order or structure.
Yeah, I mean...
or entropy, isn't it? It's entropy in thermodynamics, yeah.
Absolutely, because all order that forms will gradually break down, and there's your entropy. As atoms gradually kind of spin off back into the void again, and the pattern of the quasi-stable or quasi-regular pattern of flow begins to unravel and break down back into the flow. So yes, entropy. So anticipate, yes, although in some ways the idea of anticipation assumes that there's something like a linear history here, which is not really the way that Serres thinks about this, in as much as he thinks about connections between different thinkers, different works, different ideas, as in a more, and we might come on to this, in a more topological sense. Really, his image is imagine you took a think of the whole history of everything that philosophy and culture and science and everything else, and imagine that sort of laid out on the big sheet or a handkerchief or something is the word he uses, right? Multiple relations backwards and forwards, but we're moving in that direction. Right? And then you can, when it's all flat, you can map it very easily, but then you crumple it up and you find that points that appeared to be distant from one another are in fact quite close because everything's got folded in certain ways. This is more like what we have. And rather than saying that Lucretius anticipates what we do, I think he would more likely say that we're just close to him, we're proximate. Yeah. where actually Lucretius is our contemporary.
That's a nice way of thinking about it. And I suppose that goes back to what you were saying about contingency as well, isn't it? Because now I'm not a scientist and I don't understand entropy and thermodynamics, but I think the basic idea, as I understand it, is that with entropy, entropy is the tendency towards disorder in a system, right? So it implies that contingency is inherent to the formation of any structure. So what Lucretius gives us for Serres is this idea that contingency and chance are dominant.
Yeah, he gives us that. He certainly gives us that. The order emerges essentially by chance. He gives us the idea that the order we end up with is a pattern of regularity, shall we put it like that, which has emerged out of more chaotic states, more disordered states.
Would topology be a good word for that? That pattern of regularity. You
could talk about it in terms of topology. Yes, I like to think of it in dynamic terms, in the sense of flows that have settled into forms of regularity. So that, I mean, it says again, one of the images that he comes back to very often is that of a if you stand on a bridge and look at the river flowing underneath, bits of it are really disturbed water sort of going over the stones and so on, and then you'll see patterns where it appears to run quite straight, but then you'll find areas where it's in whirlpools, little whirls and eddies, and you think, well, how does that actually remain stable with all this flood of water rushing past it? And yet somehow it does. It just stays a little whirl somewhere, just near an interruption, near a stones or near the bank or something. And this is, again, if you like, this is our world. Our world is one of these little eddies and whirls that stays stable for a time and then will gradually, at some point, get blown back off into the
I could see why he needs the poetic side of things is there, because it's like it's a very sort of scientific idiom, scientific language is using, but it's at the same time it's got this wonderful aesthetic to it, doesn't it? It's these complexes of space, time, place, process.
The space and time thing is really important here as well, which one of the things, I mean, he picks this up from lots of places, but he does pick it up specifically from Lucretius, that the world that we're in, Lucretius says, is just one world, and that across the universe being infinite, there will be other worlds, and we don't know that they're formed in the same way that our world is. In fact, they almost certainly won't be formed in the same way that our world is, and so they'll follow different patterns and different laws, different patterns of regularity, right? And that means that we are always dealing with locality, that we don't have universal descriptions, we don't have universal laws, not even about how matter moves, basically. That the links of one event leads to another in ways that are unpredictable and not yet law governed until that movement becomes part of a stable or quasi-stable order. But to begin with, it's not, because those patterns of order have got to form, and then they will form one way here but a different way there. So we have locality, that what we have here is not the same as it will be everywhere. And that works. That's a little story which you can pick out of the way that Lucretius talks about the formation of worlds. But it's true for Serres at every level, really. So we could talk about locality in multiple ways.
Yeah, so like in an atomic level, in a sort of in minutiae, in minuscule stature, but this as well, what we're having now, or I don't know, a team in a football stadium or whatever.
Yeah, or exactly, or a wider social level, or we could talk about it like that. We can talk about it we can talk about it geographically, that what's true here will not be quite true and working in exactly the same way if we move to a different continents and different places around the world, let alone to different planets or whatever, right? We can even think about it in terms of different levels. I think this is what you were talking about there. Just really, we can say that we can think about a locality that we describe in terms of formation of the world in a geological sense, but also levels, a locality that we can talk about in terms of the emergence of life, or in terms of the emergence of human life and social life, and et cetera, et cetera. All of these things form multiple you could think of them as levels, if you like, that one emerges in certain ways from the other, and that the same patterns, as Lucretius makes clear, the same ways in which order forms are repeated, but they give rise to different forms of order.
It makes me think of a bit of a sort of an ambiguity there, I think. If you follow me, let me try this out on you.
Yeah.
He's asking what makes thinking possible, really, kind of almost Kantian in a way, like what makes thought intelligible for any particular thing in the universe.
Yes.
From the most small to the largest. But in another sense, he's still quite a materialist, isn't he? He's we need to do that in order to get rid of thought, in a sense, in order to see the world. I suppose, was it the great outdoors, as Quinton Meillassoux says it? I'm not sure if those two are reducible to each other, but you follow me?
I do, and I think you're right. You're onto something there. I think you're quite right to point that out. One way, something I could say about that, or a way I like to think about it, is that Serres, this goes right to the beginning, back to the beginning of our conversation. Serres is not interested in the philosophy of the subject, right? He's just not interested in that whatsoever. What he's thinking, it's not just something that happens in my head, and it's not the creation of meaning out of my experience or transcendental forms of consciousness or anything like this, right? Thinking for him is part of the relations between all things. And that's not just human things, but all things, in effect, right? So what he says is that everything communicates with everything else, and that we can think about this through information theory, saying that everything receives information, stores it, processes it, and
translates,
re-emits it, translates, exactly. Everything is a translator, basically, right? Everything. So not just people who actually translate books, but everything, because even the things around us on the table here receive light and reflect it out again. They take heat in, they emit it again. They've all kinds of other forms of relation. They'll be absorbing stuff out of the atmosphere and storing it and then remitting it again in different ways and so on. So everything is communicating, thinking, and in a sense everything is thinking. Everything communicates, everything. Thinking is just a part of this. It's a way we take part in this.
One of the concepts that he uses is the black box.
Yes.
And I have a bit of a brief quote here from his book, The Five Senses. I think it's translated title. And he says, take a black box. To its left or before it, there is the world. To its right or after it, travelling along circuits, there is what we call information. The energy of things goes in, disturbance of the air, shocks and vibrations, heat, alcohol or ether salts, photons. And he goes on and he says information comes out, and his even meaning comes out.
The meaning comes out, and we generally think about that in terms of the way in which as he puts it, the energies and material elements of the world, the hard, are sensed by us, as that book talks about, the five senses, and that then something happens in us and we end up producing meaning out of it, right? But we are only a singular example of a generalized process. Everything is doing this somehow.
So everything is generating meaning in some way.
In some ways, yes, because it radiates something out. It emits something, and that's it. That is its translation of what it took in. Right. What it emits is, in effect, its interpretation of the world, its expression of the world, right? So everything is doing this, and thinking is, a part of the way that we do this. It's a very particular example of it, and I think Serres would say it's a particularly inventive way of doing this, but it is still one variation on all of those other variations that we could find in the world of everything doing this all of the time. So what you mentioned his materialism. I mean, he sometimes gets a little bit sort of uncomfortable with that term, but I think it does a lot of work in terms of saying, describing his thinking. I don't feel too uncomfortable with that. Thinking in this way, just as I've explained about thinking as a variation on all the other forms of communication that everything has with everything else, is a way of understanding how we as human beings are in no way exceptional. We are simply doing what everything else does, but just in a particular way that it's developed in this rather strange thing that we call the human body and mind and so on. Yeah.
Now, I'd like to talk about some of his other concepts as well.
Yeah.
And one of the figures, I thought this would be a useful way to get a sort of an entry point into Michel Serres. One of the figures that he uses is the Harlequin. Now, the Harlequin is a kind of a composite figure. I always think of it as sort of multicolored clothes stitched together.
Yes.
And he's drawn to this figure because, and this follows on from what you've actually just been saying, he's resistant to the notion of concepts, and he rather thinks of it in terms of types or archetypes or personages.
Start with that point. The beginning of his book Genesis, he says, right, what I'm going to try and do is think multiplicity without the concept. To any good post-Kantian philosopher, that sounds like a
big no-no.
It's just a silly thing.
It's an anathema, yeah.
And obviously he's being deliberately provocative to an extent there, and playful. But he actually is doing this, trying to think multiplicity without the concept, because the concept will take something which is unformed, form it. Right? Now, what Serres is doing by contrast is to take something that is already formed and transform it to something else. But that transformation takes place not by the application of a concept, so much as by an engagement with it through which something happens or it is placed in communication with something else. Right? So that his thinking is transformative more than it is formative, if you'll excuse that rather clunky expression, right? It reminds me also of this might be shed a little bit of light on it. It reminds me a little bit of Bachelard says in one of his books that thinking is constructive. He's thinking in particular about the way in which mathematical thinking configures the world for us in certain ways. But he says this isn't the Cartesian notion of construction where we have to raise everything to the ground, arrive at a complete zero of nothing, and they go, okay, how do we construct the world? How do we get back to the whole world? Right? And Bachelard says we don't do that. That's not how things work, and that's certainly not the way that scientific thinking works. We always begin with something, and we're always reconstructing. So we only ever reconstruct, we never construct. And I think there's something very similar with Serres. He's never starting from nothing. As I say right at the beginning, he's always in the middle of things. It's always just moving from one thing to another, translating from one thing to another, thinking out and working out how things are connected, and through thinking, actually establishing connections very often. So the other thing about the figure of Harlequin that interests him is that, as I was saying earlier, he's a thinker of locality. Right? So everything is about specificity and the detail. And that's what we find with Harlequin. His coat initially is of multiple colours, multiple designs, complex, and multiple colours. Every colour's there. Right? And there's a story which tells of the of Harlequin on stage, and the crowd tell him to take off his coat, and beneath he has another coat which is the same, and they cheer and then boo, and then take off that coat, and he takes off the coat, and he's got another one underneath which is the same, and the crowd begin to get a bit restless, and they keep on going, and eventually he takes off the final coat, and his skin is the same colour. Right, it's multiplicity. It's multiplicity right down to the bottom all the way. Okay, and they get the crowd go, ooh, but then they start to leave, and then turns into Pierre la Lune, figure of luminescent white. Right. So what's that about? Well, it's about the idea that Harlequin is this all things, all types. It's all variations together. It's that sense of there is multiplicity, there is locality. And we take all of the right approach is not to analyze, break down, to separate all of these, to try to understand them by picking one out of the rest, but to understand them all together. Right? And Pierre la Lune is the figure of wearing the luminescent white gown is the figure of this, because white is all of the colours together. right? So you arrive at a sense of the universal, which is very distinctively Serres' own, a sense of the universal as everything together, right? All variations together. And that's the way him thinking multiplicity. Now, of course, how do you do that exactly? Well, he doesn't combine things by simply saying, okay, you must consider this, 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 and this together. Now, go off and do it, and here's how to do it. He combines things by drawing the connections between them, by linking them, which he does partly through the way he writes and partly through the fact that he does combine bits of science with bits of poetry, with bits of Greek mythology, with bits of, and so on and so on. And it's by doing this that he links one thing to another and begins to form, gradually move towards something like that image of the universal, if you like, which is all variations together, not you don't reach it by standing outside and taking some grand synoptic view. You actually have to stitch them and walk together, one from one to the next.
And that then helps me link to the next concept I'd like to chat to you about. What he's doing there is he's giving a picture of how we think, what we are, and how we are in terms of the picture we build up of ourselves in terms of science is developing into the 20th century. So very sort of new science he's talking about as well. I kind of see what you were saying about Heidegger at the beginning, because like what Heidegger's critiquing is kind of like the science of the late 1900s, or the 1800s rather,
In some ways, yes.
Yeah. So then he gives us this very interesting picture of what it means to be a human being, and it's almost something that is touching on what we can now call post-humanism, I think. And he's got this concept, and I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, it's called Hominescence.
Yes.
Right, so Hominescence is trying to understand the human being as it's changes its picture of itself, his world picture of itself, to use sort of that Heideggerian language, with changes in science, technology, life extinction. So the idea is that the person that we are now bears very little similarity to the person we were, say, in the 1800s.
That's absolutely one of his terms and the title of one of his books, Hominescence. And what obviously that combines the idea of the homin, the sense of the human there, with the essence of not the essence in the sense of the Aristotelian sense, but the sense of something becoming something. So it is about the becoming of the human, and he thinks that humanity is a very distinctive form of evolution, because through our adoption of technology, and he doesn't think we're the only animals to use technology, but we do so in a distinctive way.
Beavers are pretty good.
Right? They're good, yes. He thinks we do so obviously more so and distinctively, that we've broken free, as he puts it, of a Darwinian evolution. We have what he calls an exo-Darwinian evolution.
Oh, right? Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, well, we're not trying to fit into any niche, basically. We don't have a niche.
Right, so whereas other species do, they optimize their niche in order to survive.
Yeah, humans don't. We've gone beyond that, actually, and what we've done, which is in both exciting and interesting, and also extremely dangerous, because it's exciting and interesting because we can transform ourselves in ways that aren't available to other animal forms and forms of life. He talks about the way in which technology is in effect an externalization of our faculties, so that when we develop new bits of technology, what we're doing is actually developing ourselves as human. We're not. In that sense, there is a connection to thinking about hybridity and cyborgs and so on, but he would very much emphasize this sense in which we are changing ourselves as human rather than entering into a relation with something foreign to us in any way.
So this emergence of a new humanity, then, was that something fixed, or is that something static, like the statues he talks about, right?
Yeah, humans have no definition, he says, because this is what I mentioned right at the beginning. We are de-differentiated. We develop by actually becoming less specialist in many ways, and therefore having multiple possible routes and potentials that we.
Yes, like almost a Nietzschean point, I guess, because he's saying that that is just what we are. It is neither good nor bad. It can have sort of negative consequences, and it can have quite emancipatory consequences.
It has both, and it obviously does have some emancipatory consequences. But of course, one of the reasons why we're in the mess that we're in today globally is precisely this: the fact that the human life has just exceeded its kind of situation, if you like, and has filled the globe, as he puts it. We've just taken over the earth in ways which obviously are becoming enormously problematic through.
When you talk about the environmental crisis, basically.
Yeah. That's. I mean, Serres was thinking about this back in the already by the late 70s and into the early 80s, and he wrote about it most famously in the book *The Natural Contract*, where he describes how classically social contract theory talks about the emergence of civil society by leaving nature. Right? We have to exclude nature in order to form civil society, and that essentially this has had a lot of very negative consequences because we've been dealing with nature in the same way ever since, by essentially ignoring it and treating it as something that can just take care of itself out there somewhere, and that we can't do that anymore because, as he puts it, the nature has become a quasi-subject. It's acting back on us as
So he's remarkably prescient then.
And you can find there are ways in which it's you can see these ideas being taken up in sort of Gaia theory and in Bruno Latour's work and so on. Not always in the same ways. I think they're quite distinctive, but there are features of this in thinking like that. Yeah.
So specifically for Serres, then, he's asking us to revise our view of the political order, and he's asking us at the same time for a new type of social contract. Is that right?
Yeah, the social contract must be rewritten to include nature, basically. It becomes a natural contract. That's the idea. Now, it's what we make of that from Serres' work is something of an open question. I mean, he proposes certain things which might look a little bit almost a bit naive in certain ways. I mean, he proposes that we should have transnational institutions which include...
Don't hold your breath.
No.
That's what the realist will say, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Which could include the parties that represent the natural world. So in that way, it is literally extending democratic representation to nature. And he thinks that science can do this. He has a lot of very negative things to say about science, especially in his early work, but he thinks in later sciences, particularly through climate science, he sees something change, that science is actually working much more with rather than against and on the natural world. So he thinks that science might be able to do this. Well, I don't know. I mean, he maybe is being a bit hopeful. But there are different ways in which you might be able to begin to think about this idea of a contract with the non-human world. By moving through some of the ideas we talked about already in terms of how order forms and how everything is relational and so on. So I think there are routes that you can go through to begin to develop that thinking in ways.
It's a very radical thought, I think, David, isn't it? Because
always developed very explicitly in his work.
Yeah, sorry to cut across you. It's quite a radical thought, that, because he's going against the political canon.
Yes.
I think the political canon starts with Hobbes, and what's Hobbes saying is like we formed the social contract in order to stave off nature, to keep it sort of over there.
Yes.
Because it's nasty, brutish, and short. Life is vicious, and we do that in order to enhance our enlightened self-interest.
Yes, exactly. And his view is a little bit more optimistic than that, I suppose you could say. I mean, I think you said earlier on that there's the sense in which the emergence of order and how it works and what comes of it is not necessarily good or bad. It's just what it is. Yeah, I think he'd go along with that. We can sustain ourselves in forms of life which are pleasurable and equable and just, indeed, in certain ways. But we'll never be able to achieve this permanently and completely. And equally, we don't do it. We do it if we are going to do it. If we are going to do it, we must do it in something like a symbiotic relationship with the non-human world around us. It's not something which we can achieve in isolation from that, and because that inevitably leads for him to all kinds of negative things, but certainly it would lead to the objectification of the natural world, and in ways which have very clearly come back to damage us and the planet, obviously. So it's a balance. There's a good and the bad that can come with that, and he's. But there is more of an optimism in it than the Hobbesian story you tell, where everything natural just looks like something that has to be kept at bay and overcome in order to establish a safe human society or of some kind.
Well, that makes sense because we are natural beings.
Yeah, and we have to embrace that completely in for Serres. It's just a matter of understanding what that can mean and in terms of the way that we think, act, and kind of communicate with each other and the world around us.
So just to draw things to a close then, David, a couple of small questions for you. So if you were going to recommend someone a way into Serres, where would you recommend they start? Mm-hmm. And, why should we read Serres today? Why do you think he's important? Because you're clearly enthusiastic about his ideas, I think.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's true. I am. I think why read Serres, he feels very timely now, in as much as what are some of the main themes that we can pick out of his thinking? Well, these questions of our relationship to the non-human world, and the fact that the human and the non-human have always been entangled with each other. They're not really separate realms, even ever in the first place. And that's a very current topic. He writes some very interesting things about education and about how we should reform education to become less specialist, right? And so that people, so the scientists actually have an education in the arts, the artists have an education in the sciences, because a lot of the topics we've been talking about cross all of these boundaries and borders, and yet the way in which people are trained to think tends to be very specialist and compartmentalized, and he's very much against that. So he has a lot of interesting things to say about education. I think he's got interesting things to say about what it is to be human. He's got interesting to say about communication, about the world of technology. He thinks like no other thinker I can put my finger on right now. So he's interesting for that reason. It's a way of communicating between philosophy and the sciences, and making drawing out things of interest from work in the sciences, especially over the last couple of 100 years, and seeing how that thinking in science can be extended into philosophy in ways that are really interesting, important, and creative. So it's a way of bringing a lot of these things together. That seems valuable. Where to begin? Well, I think that depends on what your interest is. I mean, if you're really interested in the environmental stuff, then The Natural Contract seems like a really obvious place to go. One of his most popular books is The Parasite, which is really interesting on this idea of inclusion and exclusion, and what it means to exist in a certain way in relation to things that we treat as other. Can we do this, and what prices do we pay when we try and do that? If you're interested in the idea of education, then the book which is translated as The Troubadour of Knowledge is a great place to begin. One of his later books, Times of Crisis. It's a nice little book to begin with on some of the crises that we're going through, in particular in relation to nature, and what sense to make of them. If you want to think about getting beyond phenomenology in certain ways and philosophy of language in certain ways, the book The Five Senses is a wonderful place to begin. And if you think about technology, then his little book Thumbelina is a wonderful little book.
I meant to ask, what's that about?
Well, it's a letter to young people, basically, saying, people complain about you because you're always on your phones and you're always, this and the other.
So it's like anti-old fart book. Yeah.
It is, yes, but it is. I think it's absolutely wonderful, because what you're doing is becoming new kinds of human beings through your new kinds of technology, right? And he goes through talking about how this works in slightly different ways, slightly different themes and examples, and he describes it as a celebration, a loving letter to the young people to say, this is wonderful.
Well, that's refreshing, isn't it?
It is, yes. That's why I say he's quite an optimistic in certain ways. He doesn't see all this stuff as terrible, dark.
Yeah, he sees the youth. He sees the youth as fecund and full of vitality and the future and optimism. Yeah,
he says, and I just wish I could live long enough to carry on that journey with you. You know, one of his books, which
that's so refreshing. He's just such not a misery, is he?
If you really want to take a deep dive into his thinking and just throw yourself in, I think the book The Incandescent is magnificent and full, absolutely just packed full of really startlingly interesting ideas and beautiful writing as well. So The Incandescent would be another place to begin.
And if you wanted David to study him, say, where would you go?
Oh, well, yeah. What could I possibly say? I mean, there are some really good people around the world. Obviously, there's Chris Watkin and Monash, and there's a few very good people in Paris and elsewhere in France. But you could do worse than coming here to Staffordshire with us.
With
us, yeah, because. As you can tell, I'm really interested in Serres. Bill Ross, who I've worked with very closely on Serres, is extremely knowledgeable on all of this stuff, and especially on the Leibniz connections, and especially on all the connections with mathematics and science.
So you could come study our MA, couldn't you?
You could, for example, come and study our
We've got to plug our pluggables, David.
I was getting there, but why not? Absolutely.
I'm more shameless than you, yeah.
Yes, come and do our MA in the Philosophy of Nature, Information and Technology. Come and talk to us about any research projects you've.
Thanks, David. That's brilliant. Fantastic.
Thank you.